Good evening, everyone. I'm Marie Griffith. I'm the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and we are delighted to welcome you to this evening's program on Welcoming the Stranger to St. Louis, Religious Responses to Recent Immigrants and Refugees. And while I want to think that every program that we do is special in some way, this one truly speaks to urgent issues in our own time, as federal government officials battle over America's immigration and refugee policies in ways that many of us find frightening. Harking back more to the draconian immigration law passed in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act and its related acts, many of you know, targeted specific ethnic populations, largely Italians, Eastern European Jews, and persons from all across Asia. Then the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which removed the emphasis on race altogether and instead emphasized family reunification and skilled workers. And although St. Louis is neither a port city nor a border town, it's been a home for immigrants and refugees for many decades. And so we're so glad to have this opportunity tonight to learn more about this part of our region's history and the present really good work being done by the International Institute of St. Louis, as well as religious congregations and organizations. So our format for this evening is this. Our first speaker, Anna Crosslin, will discuss the work of the International Institute of St. Louis, and following her remarks, a panel of local religious leaders will discuss the actions their communities are pursuing to serve immigrants and refugees in the St. Louis area. So I'll introduce them before they come up. And we'll have ample time for discussion and Q&A after that. Anna Crosslin is the president and CEO of the International Institute of St. Louis, our region's welcome center for new Americans. She has led the International Institute since 1978. The Institute offers a wide array of integrative services to more than 7,000 immigrants from 80 countries nationally. It is widely respected for its English and citizenship preparation, workforce development and career path services, small business development, and therapeutic counseling services. And some of you may also know its annual Festival of Nations draws more than 100,000 visitors annually. In 2012, Anna served as a co-founder of the St. Louis Mosaic Project, where she continues to serve on the steering committee. Mosaic is a nationally recognized immigration attraction initiative which engages city and county officials, corporate, higher education, and immigrant integration leaders in building a more welcoming and inclusive St. Louis to benefit all residents. Anna is the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions. I'm not going to read all of them here, but since 2000, she's routinely been identified as one of the St. Louis Business Journal's most influential St. Louisans, including awards for minority and women's leadership. And in 2016, she was the recipient of the prestigious St. Louis Award, established in 1931 by David Wohl. The award is given annually to a St. Louis resident who has brought greatest honor to the community. She's also a past recipient of leadership awards from many organizations, serves as a board member of the St. Louis Regional Chapter, chair of the board of the National Asian Pacific Center for Aging in Seattle, and as a gubernatorial appointee to the Missouri Commission on Human Rights. In June 2015, she was recognized as a White House champion of change for World Refugee Day, and has been awarded 2 honorary doctorates, one from Webster and one right here at Washington University, which is also her alma mater. So please join me in welcoming Anna Crosslin.
We'll pause for a moment, let people get seated. Good evening.
Good evening.
You know, today we find ourselves living in a climate of overt hostility toward the other. This is not new. You heard Marie, in fact, a moment ago, mention a little bit about it. But Americans have indeed been virulently anti-immigrant, anti-other in the past. For instance, the term nativism was first used in 1844, gaining its name from Native American, the parties of the 1840s and 1850s. In this context, though, native doesn't mean indigenous Americans or American Indians, but rather those that descended from the inhabitants of the original 13 colonies. Nativists especially objected to Irish Roman Catholics because they questioned their loyalty, which they felt was primarily to the Pope. Most newcomers were hated and feared by those who had settled as little as a generation earlier. The claim was that most new immigrants had no gene for democracy. They were too racially different and could not assimilate. Nativist movements included the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s, the Immigrant Restriction League of the 1890s, and a variety of anti-Asian movements. Americans feared being overwhelmed with people who weren't like them. Does that sound familiar? Maybe we're hearing it today again. At the turn of the 20th century, the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, stepped into this environment. Its national board recognized the need for specialized services for foreign-born. So they created a department of immigrant and foreign communities to oversee field offices and projects called International Institutes. Jane Addams, with Hull House in Chicago, created a model for meeting immigrant needs. It was located in an immigrant neighborhood, provided social and humanitarian services, taught English, and created opportunities for cultural growth and expression. Edith Terry Bremer, learning from this model, launched the first International Institute in New York City in 1911. St. Louis opened in 1919. By 1925, there were 55 international institutes, primarily located in the industrial Northeast, the Midwest, and in California, which already led the nation in immigrant population, with 52% of Californians being immigrants or their children. In the early years of the International Institute movement, as it was called, 3 themes coalesced to become its guiding principles. They endure today: promoting ethnic identity and leadership, being inclusive, and teaching democracy and self-reliance. In spite of such initiatives, public and political fervor finally boiled over, resulting in the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924. The act set the total immigration quota at 165,000 people for countries outside of the Western Hemisphere. That was an 80% reduction from pre-World War I numbers. Quotas for specific countries were based on 2% of the US population that the country had recorded as admissions in 1890. Important to remember that. So, populations poorly represented in 1890 were prevented from immigrating in proportionate numbers, especially Italians and Jews, and all Asians were banned. The result of the act was a 20-year period of isolation with large-scale immigration to the United States and an end for all but a few Western Europeans. That situation didn't begin to ease until after World War II, and eventually, more dramatically, with the passages of the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Refugee Act of 1980. So America's immigrant history has always been a struggle of newcomer and long-timer. With each new group, it begins with a conflict due to perceived differences. It only eases when people find common ground in their shared values and beliefs. The current political and social environments have added new twists to the immigrant and refugee integration process. In addition to anti-immigrant hostility, immigrants and refugees face societal challenges, including the demographics of St. Louis. We're an aging population. We're older and whiter than the rest of the nation. To welcome people who don't look like us is harder because we've always lived around people who in fact look just like other St. Louisans. We have a smaller foreign-born population relative to similar cities. St. Louis, 6.7% of the population is foreign-born, compared to 33% in New York City, 24% in Chicago. The city of Los Angeles, 80% foreign-born. You look at the 20 cities ahead of us on the MSA at this point, and all 20 of those cities reflect 3 to 4 times the percentage of foreign-born that we have here in St. Louis. Important to remember that. Also, we have a sharply increasing racial and economic set of inequalities. Rich and poor, white and black, real conflicts here in St. Louis and a great need. Also, the admissions of individuals, refugees from abroad. The individuals have changed in terms of background and religion. We have far more individuals now who are coming from Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and other non-Christian faiths. And that also has impact then on sentiments, welcoming sentiments toward these individuals. In addition, the foreign-born themselves are challenged by widely varying needs, including language. Do they speak English or not? How well do they speak English? Culture, education, skills, experience, job experience. Have they in fact spent decades in a refugee camp somewhere waiting to be able to be admitted to a country of asylum, including the United States? Age. Sometimes they're very young, but sometimes they're very old. And being able to start over again and be self-sufficient when people get to be my age, it's harder. There's no question, it's harder. And health and trauma, particularly for the refugee populations. Remaining in a refugee camp for a long period of time can be a debilitating experience. You could actually enter a refugee camp more healthy than you leave. And finally, legal status. When we look at issues of challenge in this country with the foreign-born, you cannot avoid the fact that legal status has a big impact on ability to be able to successfully resettle over here. So efforts, it must be wider in terms of addressing the needs, not just of the foreign-born population. We have to look at issues that face the foreign-born population in the context of the wider community and their needs as well. If our desire is to create a welcoming community for immigrant newcomers, then we have to address the needs of all people in the community, foreign-born and native-born alike. I want to thank our faith-based collaborators, some of whom are speaking this evening. I'm really proud to be associated with them and the literally hundreds of faith-based institutions and members who are working to help create that welcoming community that's so vital to our region's success. And now, in this context, I'd like to offer a quick bird's-eye view of the International Institute and a few of the ways in which we have recently collaborated with faith organizations to be able to do the work of welcoming the stranger. But I won't go into great detail about the actual events because I don't want to steal the thunder of the individuals who are going to be speaking in a few minutes. But let me, first of all, and primarily, have any of you visited the International Institute before? Oh my God, look at all these hands. Have you visited the International Institute since we moved into the former St. Elizabeth Academy? Oh, a few there too, great. We relocated in 2015 to the site of the former St. Elizabeth Academy in the 3400 block of Arsenal in South City. And for some of you who may not know, it was for more than 100 years the site of the Order of the Most Precious Blood, which is a teaching order here in St. Louis, of their school, where they educated immigrant girls. And one of the things they said to us when we bought the building and moved back into it was they felt like it was really a good full circle at that point because 100 years ago they were educating immigrant young girls, and today immigrant girls and boys are actually able to learn at the International Institute again. But I'm going to go fairly quickly through this, and so if you have any questions about any of the services, slides, things that you see, then certainly during the Q&A we can discuss in more detail. But let's see, could I do this now? Where do I have to point this? Is that the problem I'm having? Did it forward? It did not forward. Where's the little reader thing? That's what the infrared. Is this it up here? No, that's the. It doesn't want to move. See? All right, we'll do it that way. Yes. It failed. Maybe the battery is not good, but it doesn't want to go. So we'll just do it manually. Anyway, on an angle, just went twice now.
No,
That's fine. It was good.
Technology. I swear to God. You know, I regard myself as relatively sophisticated in technology, and still I don't have a clue. I used to have to ask my 4-year-old daughter at the time how to be able to load something. But anyway, the International Institute on an annual basis serves about 7,000 people from about 100 countries. It's an incredibly diverse population. One of the things to remember about St. Louis, while we don't have lots of numbers of immigrants at this point, we have a very diverse population. I sometimes say we're as diverse as Chicago. The difference is in Chicago they might have thousands of a certain population, a certain country. Here we might have a handful, but it's a very diverse population. Well, I'm going to use an arrow. Yes, okay. One of the things we do is we are the largest English as a second language site in the state, and so we offer morning, afternoon, and evening classes for about 1,200 people a year. Our refugee resettlement program until 2 years ago was really pretty large. We were resettling about 1% of the refugees resettled in the United States, but the travel bans last year and continuing tampering down by the administration, the federal administration, with regards to refugee resettlement resulted in a drop here in St. Louis of refugee resettlement from 2016 of 1,158 refugees to 181 refugees last year. One of the things that we work very hard at doing but never can do enough of is providing community orientation for the newcomers. Imagine what it must be like if you got over here and you didn't have a clue what a parking meter is, or how to be able to use an ATM machine, etc. This is all new to everybody, and so we have to start over from square one with most of them, and that's an area in which we very much rely on volunteers to be able to assist us. Another thing that we try to do is be able to help them understand the community in which they've moved at this point so that they can have the opportunity to really have some enriching experience, especially as a family. So this is a visit to the Art Museum and a discussion, that's for my staff there, who's talking about Missouri art and history. This is a summer program that's been operated at the International Institute the last 2 summers with really active involvement and sponsorship this last year from the Jewish community and the Jewish Community Relations Council. I won't talk about it a lot because I suspect it'll come up later. But here is our after-school program that we just started providing last year. We introduced it in late summer. It ran parallel to our summer camp program over the summer. And then we had enrollment in the fall. I just looked at the numbers, in fact, for a report today. And of the fall session, this is really, to me, amazing, but in the fall session, the number of the 20 people who got through and filled out all the paperwork and studied all the days, etc. 18 of the 20 increased at least one grade in one of their classes. But what was incredible was all the way down to 25% of them increased one grade in 4 of their classes. So the impact of this program for people who in some cases have never been to classes before is incredible. These are actually graduates of something called CAPE, which is Career Access for International Professionals. These are, I think, 3 of these individuals are engineers. There's also a chemist, and I forget quite frankly what the 5th one is, but these are people who come over here with a lot of skills that are really beneficial in St. Louis if we could just figure out how to get them recertified and help them to learn networking and be able to figure out how to be able to get into the American work system. So that's what CAPE and our Career Pathways services are all about. For those who don't go on to higher education but have a really good idea and want to be an entrepreneur, then we have what we call our micro-lending program, where we give loans to individuals who are not yet bankable but have a really good idea in terms of how they want to be able to start over in the community as an entrepreneur. In this case, this is the brother of an owner. It's a Syrian family that arrived here in 2012, so 7 years ago. He now owns a pita plant, a bakery, and they sell through Deerbergs and a couple of other networks. It's Sham Bakery, C-H-A-M. Buy it the next time you're at the store. And he's now producing about 5,000 packages a week.
Wow.
And here we have our urban garden program, which is down on Folsom in the I forget the name of the district, but anyway, in the Midtown medical area. And some of our clients actually raise items that they sell through CSA programs or markets, and others just raise especially agricultural items that are indigenous to their own cultures that they want to be able to serve on their own tables. One of the things that we do is we help people get their U.S. citizenship. There are huge barriers to being able to do it. If you're lucky enough to be on the citizenship path, after 5 years you can apply for U.S. citizenship. The application and process costs you about $1,000 per person, and everybody over 14 years of age has to apply on their own. So you can see some of these families, it's hugely expensive to be able to do. But there are all sorts of studies about how if people, particularly adults, achieve U.S. citizenship, how much more engaged they are in a community, but also then how much more money they earn on an hourly basis. Festival of Nations. One of my favorites, I would love this event even if I didn't direct the International Institute, because it's while it's a lot about the food, it's also about coming together in a culture where you're not afraid, and where you can learn with a wide-eyed sense of wonder and meet people that you might not otherwise have an opportunity to meet in the community. This is an iftar dinner that we did last May in collaboration with the Turkish American community here in St. Louis. They made the food and brought it to the Institute gym, and we had about 220 people there who really were able to learn about Ramadan and iftar as part of a wonderful opportunity of breaking bread together. But we also are very much aware that we have to reach out into the community and offer opportunities for people to learn, to develop knowledge about a lot of subjects that you're hearing about on the news, but in fragments, and that you can't always put the fragments together to know what the real issues are. So, for instance, in 2018, we offered, among our other offerings in our Bagels and Coffee series, we offered a program on DACA and one about the crisis at the southern border. And in December, one about the migrant caravan, so that people could understand what the push factors were that were driving the development over and over again of these migrant caravans. If you're interested, you can give me your email address, and I would be happy to add anybody to the email blast list so that you can get follow-up information about any of these offerings should you want to be involved. But then in December, for several years now, we've been doing an annual Jewish Muslim Day of Service on the 25th of December, where the Jews and Muslims come together to really do projects on that day. And once again, I won't talk about it a lot. And then here we have an event that was done last spring, and this was to commemorate the SS St. Louis, which was a boat that in 1938, I think it was turned back from U.S. shores with Jews on it. And I will not talk about it again. So anyway, I just talked really fast to get through this whole thing. But a couple of little tidbits here, so that and then I will certainly be happy to turn it over to the other speakers. So, since 1979, which is sort of the modern day beginning of refugee resettlement here in St. Louis, the International Institute has sponsored about 24,000 refugees into this community. Including large groups of Vietnamese in the 1980s and Bosnians in the 1990s, into Somalis and Iraqis and Afghans and others today. And most recently, if anybody wants to know, we're resettling Congolese also. Then we've also helped start or expand more than 600 immigrant-owned businesses in the community. And this is just a small microcosm, actually, of all the immigrant-owned businesses that have started. But as you can see here, according to the Regional Chamber and their data crunchers, just the impact of those 600 businesses, the startup or expansion on them, has a positive economic impact in this region of about $180 million. So it's not peanuts. These individuals have the drive and the skills to really contribute to the community if we can welcome them and help them transition in an effective and positive way. On an annual basis, then, we work with more than 200 local organizations to further the mission of the Institute. The representatives who will be coming up in just a moment are among those individuals, but I also do want to say that the faith-based representation in terms of who works with the International Institute is much broader than that, and that particularly that there are evangelical Christian organizations that are quite actively involved with the Institute and various programs as well. So at that point then, I got all the way through my presentation, and I'm going to let Marie come back up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I want now to introduce our three panelists who will talk about the work that their own religious communities are doing, Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim in this area. Maharat Rori Picker Neiss serves as the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis. She was pictured in one of those slides up there. Prior to that, she was Director of Programming, Education, and Community Engagement at Beis Abraham Congregation, which is a modern Orthodox Jewish synagogue in University City. She is one of the first graduates of Yeshivat Maharat, a pioneering institution training Orthodox Jewish women to be spiritual leaders and halakhic authorities. She previously served as Acting Executive Director for Religions for Peace, USA, Program Coordinator for the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, Assistant Director of Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee, and Secretariat for the International Jewish Committee on Interreligious Consultations, the formal Jewish representative in international interreligious dialogue. Rory is the co-chair of the North American Interfaith Youth Network of Religions for Peace. And she is co-editor of Interactive Faith, the Essential Interreligious Community Building Handbook. She is married to Russell Neiss, a software engineer, and they have 3 children here in St. Louis. Welcome, Rory. Javier Orozco is a Catholic theologian, educator, and leader. He is the Executive Director of Human Dignity and Intercultural Affairs for the Archdiocese of St. Louis, meaning he's a member of the senior leadership team and serves as the ecumenical and interreligious officer for the Archdiocese. He's a board member for Aquinas Institute of Theology, the White House Jesuit Retreat, Casa de Salud, and the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis. He's a representative member of the St. Louis Mosaic Project Steering Committee, the University of Missouri St. Louis Hispanic Council, and the National Catholic Association of Diocesan Directors for Hispanic Ministry. And he also served for 7 years as a member of the Public Policy Committee of the Missouri Catholic Conference. He holds a BA and MA in philosophy, an STB, and a PhD in theology. Javier completed a 2-year Christian Leadership Initiative Fellowship with the American Jewish Committee and the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He and his wife Teresa live in the Tower Grove East neighborhood of the city of St. Louis. Welcome so much, Javier. Imam Eldin Susa is the head imam of the St. Louis Islamic Center, a position he has held since 2015, which is when he came to the United States. He was born in the city of Visoko, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is a graduate of Osman F. Redzovic Madrasa in Visoko, I'm sorry for that, after which he continued his studies at the renowned Al-Azhar University in Cairo, where he obtained a degree in history through the University's School of Arabic Language. Upon graduation, he returned to Bosnia and Herzegovina and continued his education at the College of Islamic Studies in Sarajevo, where he graduated with a degree in theology. And he was employed as a professor of Arabic language and literature at the United World College in Mostar, as well as a professor of Islamic studies at a high school in Graz. Prior to his arrival in the United States, he also worked as an imam in Visegrad, eastern Bosnia, working with former refugee populations that returned to their pre-war homes. He often appears at a lecture at local churches and interfaith functions, and he and his wife, Amina, have 3 children. Welcome, Eldin, and welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. So I want to just talk for a few minutes about the Jewish community, and I think really the unique role that the Jewish community plays within this wider context. And you heard a little bit about it already, but throughout our history as a Jewish community, we have been kicked out of just about every country that we've ever lived in. And that's a memory that we carry with us. And for many of us in the Jewish community, it's not just a memory, but it's a potential reality again. We go through the world knowing that we have been unwelcome. We've been unwelcome in this country, and we've been unwelcome in other countries. And the scariest part about being unwelcome in the country that you're in is not having another place to go. And so the idea that you can have the capacity to leave a country and yet have no place that would take you in is possibly one of the most terrifying thoughts that we carry with us. Right? It's hard enough to make it out of your country, but imagine having the resources and going through all of that trouble to actually get out and then just being stuck. And so, as a Jewish community, we live with the memory of the fact that we have been refugees in this country, we have been immigrants in this country, that we know what that experience is like, and we feel a responsibility for that. I often like to, I wish I could take credit for the quote, but I have to give credit to HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is one of the national resettlement agencies, the only national Jewish resettlement agency. And they like to say, we used to resettle refugees because they were Jewish. Now we resettle refugees because we're Jewish. And that's how we like to think about it also, that our obligation is not because the people who are coming to this country are Jewish, but because we as Jews know what that experience is like. At the same time, while we live with this memory of knowing what it's like not to be welcome, we also exist in this country with a certain amount of privilege. We're very aware of the fact that over time, we have largely been perceived of as white. that this country has over time shifted a lot of their discrimination to other groups, and Jewish is not nearly as terrible a thing as it used to be. We're seen oftentimes grouped with Judeo-Christian, and so we are able to access spaces that other groups can't access. And so with that, we come with straddling these lines and thinking about what is our responsibility to have this story and to be able to enter into spaces where we can be in the conversation differently than others. And so as a Jewish community, we have really felt ourselves required to be on the front lines of this work. Through the Jewish Community Relations Council, we have formed the Jewish Coalition for New Americans, and our chair, Stan Schenker, is sitting in the audience. It is a coalition of not just our organization, but all of the congregations within the region, other Jewish organizations, individuals who also feel called to do this work. Through that, I would say our largest project, you saw one of the pictures, has been the summer camp in partnership with the International Institute. And that was really a conversation where we were able to sit down with Anna and say, we feel so helpless with the situation that we see going on around us. I guess 3 years ago. We feel so helpless. What can we do? How can we contribute? How can we help? And over brainstorming, it came up that there used to be this summer camp. There hadn't been. That there are children who, when school is out of session, still need someone to care for them while their parents are studying English or doing job training. The 90-day period that refugees have doesn't go on hold with summer break. And we said, we know how to do summer camps, we're pretty good at it. And so this will be our 3rd year in partnering and being able to bring our Jewish volunteers, not just Jews, but organized through the Jewish community, to play with the kids, to expose them to St. Louis, to English, to all of the different cultural components of life here, and free up their parents to really prepare for a successful life. We've had congregations adopting families, collecting resources, as you've seen, the day of service where we've come together. And what's so impactful in all of those has been giving people their own stories to tell. It's changed the narrative for our community as people have met these families. And then when we talk about refugees now, we're not just talking about our history, but we're talking about the family we just met with, or the kids we just played with. And we're able to help carry their stories as well. We also do a significant amount of advocacy, not just as a Jewish community, but combined with other faith communities. We were meeting with many elected officials around family separation, advocating for legislation, for DACA and improved immigration, paths to immigration. And then also what you saw a picture, working with our interfaith partners to do a commemoration for the MS St. Louis. And what is so significant, and this year, by the way, it's going to be June 6th, it's the 80th anniversary coming up this year. We're partnering also with the Missouri History Museum. What's so significant is that this is a story of a passenger ship trying to escape Nazi Germany, exactly the story I started with. It's a group of people who managed to collect the money to get on this ship. You can only imagine what that journey was like, feeling that they had finally escaped and were traveling to freedom, only to then land in Cuba and be denied entry, try to get off the coast of the United States, to be told that they would not be allowed to even land in Miami, to go up the coast along to Canada, to be turned away there, and then what that journey must have been like, knowing that they were going back to Europe with no knowledge of what their future would hold. And of the people who were sent back to mainland Europe, more than half of them were then murdered in the Holocaust. And so we get together, we bring our interfaith partners together, and we recite the names of all of the people who were killed. We hold up their pictures. And we try to keep their memory alive, both because of what was lost for them and because we need to remember that when we close our borders, there are real lives at stake. People are dying. And so we feel that not only is that story significant for the Jewish community, but it's become a point of shame in our American history. The mayor of St. Louis apologized a number of years ago. The Prime Minister of Canada apologized last year. And so we want to remind people that this isn't only an embarrassment years later when we decide that a group of people is not as scary as we originally thought, but this is an embarrassment now. When we turn people away from our borders now, that's an embarrassment to all of us. And as you heard in the presentation, it's a loss to our community, and it's a loss for all of the potential that we gain and all of the lives and what those lives will ultimately produce. We're also just really proud as a community. I'd say there's just, because of those stories we carry, just individuals. I don't even know all of the numbers, but I know so many of them are volunteers at the Institute. They teach English classes, they mentor, they support people, hire immigrants, hire refugees, really just try to make sure that we can change the narrative of this story. That just because we know what our own history has been means that we get to retell who we are as Americans for what that new story will be for the next group of people that chooses to come.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And thank you, Nori and your staff, for inviting us. This is a very moving event, personally for me, but also I think for all of us here present. So we thank you, and I thank you for the opportunity. Obviously, in the time we have limited time, but I do want to just maybe begin by a few frames to enter the Catholic narrative on this issue of immigration. I think many of us who may have grown up Catholic were used to the idea that that this narrative begins in one way with the Irish, John Carroll in the late 1700s. But of course, this narrative continues to today, 2019, in the border, Mexico and the U.S. So again, I'm mindful that how does one cover that whole narrative, But it's important to acknowledge that this is not a new narrative for the Catholic imagination, certainly not a new narrative for the Catholic way of moving through it, and the sensibility that Catholics have had since in the late 1700s. So I mentioned that only as a frame of reference for us, to keep in mind that we are covering centuries of Catholics trying to wrestle with this question of how do we welcome the immigrant? How do we welcome the person that feels and tastes differently? So I mentioned that as an opening comment. I also mentioned this other comment. How do you think about the immigrant experience? How do we think about it? How are we to think about this topic of welcoming the immigrant? I think a lot of the work that the Catholic community has done, both nationally and locally, has to do with, at least minimally, working hard to raise the awareness, the understanding, and the actions that are to be part of that response as we try to welcome those who perhaps are perceived as different. And as I mentioned, for the Catholic community, this is not a new narrative. As a matter of fact, the bishops have been very explicit in our own time, in the last, at least I can say, the last 25 years, working very systematically to ensure that at least one part of that narrative that deals with the undocumented and the issues, the policies, that we support, humane immigrant reform, that we deal directly with prudence, with intentionality, the broken system that separates families and denies due process. So again, this narrative from the Catholic perspective of being in the public square with a clear intentionality has been there and will continue to be there. I just want to highlight another theoretical observation before I move into the practical dimension of our conversation. And that is, because we've been dealing with this narrative for over at least 200 years, if not more, we've developed a language to understand this narrative for ourselves as Catholics and to enter that public square in a way that is meaningful to those interlocutors that we engage in this process of solidarity. So I'll just mention some of them, may be familiar for some of you who are Catholic in the audience, or some of you have engaged Catholics in one way or another. Those are the guiding principles that have come out of our Catholic social teachings, which has its beginning systematically in 1898 or 1892. So this idea that we can think through, that we can be attentive to the narrative of the other. Here I just mentioned some guiding principles that might be helpful. One is to think about this in terms of human dignity. So what are we talking about if we are not talking about human dignity? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second one is, can we agree on the common good? How do we engage this narrative in a way that highlights this commitment to the common good? The other one is this idea of subsidiarity, that any action we engage in has to always begin with the base, with the person, respecting and not usurping or taking the voice of those communities that have their own voice and will always have their own voice. And then, of course, the fourth one, solidarity, that somehow we are all connected to one another. I mentioned those theoretical comments only to engage now to the practical aspect of our conversation that we were asked to also share. That is, what is the role, what has been done locally, or how do we move through this in a practical way? Here I just want to offer real quickly for our conversation 5 different dimensions or expressions of that action that has been part of our Catholic community, certainly here in St. Louis and in our region. First is this commitment to intercultural competence. You know, it was already mentioned, we are talking about engaging the particular story and journey of immigrants. So how do we create those conditions so that we can really listen to that story and not come up with our own preconceived agendas on what they need or what we need to do for them? So I think this intercultural competence theme is very important for us, especially when we talk about, you know, the immigrant, to not see them just as a statistic. Because the immigrant, as Pope Francis has reminded us over and over, the immigrant brother and sister, they have a name, a face, and a story. So I raised that, and I think here locally, we have worked very hard, and we'll continue to do that in our parishes, in our community, using all the different resources. How do we engage ourselves interculturally? How do we create those spaces that tell our stories? The second one is education, helping individuals in the community learn more about the rights in the immigrant system, especially in relationship to the Catholic social teachings. One of the things that I often try to stress when I visit the Catholic communities in our parishes here in the Archdiocese is to remind ourselves we are heirs to a rich tradition that already calls us, but how do we educate the average Catholic in the pew? When was the last time you heard a sermon preach on immigration? Those are the type of things that I think become important for our communities and become important for our Catholic narrative on the issue, especially to bring the light of faith into that ongoing education that needs to accompany many of us. The third theme or expression that I would highlight for our conversation, it's already been mentioned, but I think it's important to say here, is the theme of advocacy. I think St. Louis and our Catholic community has been very consistent in advocating. Certainly as a Catholic community, and those of us that are Catholic and are familiar with the way the Catholic Church and the structures work, we recognize that this advocacy is not disjointed, that there is a national way in which we continue to connect. And I just want to flag for all of us the work of the Justice for Immigrants. You know, the Bishops' Conference has, for the last at least 20 plus years, working for the Justice for Immigrants campaign. You can go on the website and find all kinds of practical tools inviting the Catholic community to be proactive, to be engaged in the issue. The Public Policy Committee of the Missouri Catholic Conference, where I had the privilege to serve for 7 years, has been very intentional in looking at the local bills that come up, the legislature. How can we engage the local politicians? How do we engage them in conversations that can lift up the stories? You may be familiar, some of you, with the Archbishop's own commitment to this issue on the Peace and Justice Commission when he established it here locally. So again, I raise those issues to sort of remind us of some of the advocacy work that's being done. The direct legal services that the Archdiocese staff, I just want to lift up for all of us, St. Francis Community Services, the Catholic Legal Clinic, that again, many of our brothers and sisters who need those social services or legal services are there to serve them. And finally, I just want to mention as another theme is this idea of pastoral accompaniment. As you know, the Archdiocese is very rich in terms of the parish life. There too, we have a strong commitment. Just to give you an idea of the diversity, we have 12 parishes in the Archdiocese that serve the Hispanic community. We have the Vietnamese community parish. We have also worked with the Filipinos, the Brazilian community, the Korean community. Again, how do we put our resources and how are we consistently accompanying those communities? So I mentioned those 5 areas as thematic for our conversation, but I think reflect the deep commitment that the Catholic Church in St. Louis has for this particular narrative. Thank you.
Bismillah, in the name of God. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum. Peace be to all of you. First, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Thank Washington University for organizing this event, and especially I want to thank Anna and the International Institute for all help they provide to those who are in need, and especially since I'm Bosnians, for all help they provide and gave to Bosnians. And I think that although we in St. Louis have some issues, we have some problems, we already spoke about these problems, I can say from my perspective as Bosnian, although I'm not a refugee, I came quite recently, from my perspective and from my experience and what I know from Bosnians who came here as refugees, that they really found St. Louis to be a welcoming place. And even after the first original refugees came here to St. Louis, many of others who came to some other places in all over the United States moved to St. Louis, mostly because of the nature of St. Louis, of St. Louis being a welcoming place. I really know that there are issues, but still it's not all that black. So we are to some, at least when it comes to Bosnians, I think that it's probably, and I will agree, it's one of the most positive examples of how St. Louis helped refugees and how refugees from other side helped at least one part of St. Louis, its South City and South County. And me being Imam, I also need to remind us that we must not let fear, and you proved as St. Louis, you proved that there wasn't any fear toward refugees at that time when you admitted Bosnians into St. Louis. We must not let that fear creep into our hearts and our minds now. And it would be totally against our humanity, and it would be totally against our beliefs if we are believers, whether if we are Muslims, whether if we are Catholics, Jews, or whatever. It would be against our beliefs to refuse to help those who are in need, who are fleeing persecution. Just imagine to close your door to one who is trying to escape from persecutor, and you are closing your door and saying, go back to persecutor. We know what, and just to be honest with ourselves, we know what will happen with them if they go back. They are not fleeing because it's all honey and milk over there. They are basically fleeing killing. They are fleeing and trying to save their lives and lives of their kids. So that's something we need to have in mind. This is the word we need. We need to spread out, to spread to those people who maybe who forgot this. All of us are at some point, we were refugees. Even of prophets. We know Muhammad, peace be upon him, he is our prophet, and he was refugee himself. The same as Jesus, peace be upon him, the same as Abraham, the same as Joseph, the same as Moses, the same as all of these we claim to follow. So if we want to follow them, if we are saying that we are following them truly, then we shouldn't be, and we cannot be the one who will say to those who seek refuge, to say to them no. We have examples we need to follow, and those examples, for me, it's Muhammad, peace be upon him. It can be also for me, Jesus, peace be upon him, Moses. For some of you, it's Jesus, the main example you need to follow, and you know better than I know how can and how will he behave toward those who seek refuge. We as Muslim community, I think this is what we are trying to have in mind. And we are really trying, although we are quite new community, we are quite new to this place. Bosnians, for example, have been here for 20 years. We have our own problems, we have our own issues. Many of Bosnians still didn't forget what happened back in Bosnia, still live under oppression of the old life. The new generations is probably adapting more to the American way of life. So we have our own issues, the same as other Muslim communities which are relatively new in St. Louis, but we are trying in the amount of our capabilities to help those who are seeking refuge and who come to St. Louis, newcomers to St. Louis. Maybe our experience as refugees is something they need really. And we are trying to give them at least the help we received at the beginning. I know that International Institute is doing what they can do, but sometimes the help they can provide, not because of them, but because of many other things, isn't enough for those who come. Basically, just imagine that you come from the place where you don't speak, to some place where you don't know the language, where some of them don't know even the letters, the Latin letters you use here. So it's totally new situation. For Bosnians, it also was a new situation, and International Institute helped them a lot, but also their own communities. For example, since many migrants now are Muslims, we are trying to help not only them, since as Muslims we are obliged to help those who are seeking refuge, no matter what they are or who they are and what religion they follow. But we will help them, and we try to help them. And trying to help them, we have managed to put things, I think, right, and we are now providing for them, for example, assistance when it comes to not only furniture, but when it comes to renting and spaces or utility assistance. The same as we help them in food and clothing, or help them basically in collecting food and then distributing. There is something and that's the pillar of Islam. This is what we really use to help those who are in need. It's called zakah. It's one of the pillars of Islam. It's basically charity we as Muslims are obliged to give as a donation to those who are in need. And what every masjid or Muslim place of worship here in St. Louis is doing is that we collect these charities, whether it be zakat or sadaqah, and then distribute it to those who are in need. And it can be a really big amount at the end. When you consider that there is almost 18 masajids or 18 places of worship now in St. Louis, and which are the part of Imam Council of Metropolitan Area of St. Louis, we still have something to work on. For example, sometimes we overlap even with International Institute. Maybe sometimes most of us focus on the same group of the people, and especially on those who are brave enough to ask for help. And those who are brave enough to ask for help, they will go from place to place. And what we will need to work in future more than just to provide help is to coordinate even more between Muslim places of worship, between different masajids, since we as Muslim community St. Louis are really diverse, from Bosnians, Middle Easterns, Arabs, Turks, Pakistani community. There is even small but really vital African American community. So it's not an easy task to coordinate all of these activities. But that's what we need to work on. And in addition, since I'm running out of time, I will just mention that some other activities we provide, the same as others. We are trying to connect newcomers, new refugees with employers from our community or with people who can help them find jobs. We are organizing Saturday and Sunday classes for their kids. We sometimes help simply by visiting them. And I must mention one of the I will say Muslim organizations that work, that does the best work here in St. Louis in recent years. It's House of Goods or Beit Mal, and their volunteers, brother Jamal, and Sister Lisa, and others, who are really doing a great job. And what they are doing is better than what even other organizations, even my masjid, is doing. They collect furniture, food, whatever is needed, and they take it and tow it to the refugees for free, totally for free. So it's basically the best help they can provide. Okay, thank you. I think I'm not.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the audience right away, and I'm just going to ask you, we've got a wonderfully large crowd, and I didn't say at the beginning to welcome all of you. I'm so happy to see so many people here. If you would just please be considerate of other audience members who want to ask a question and be concise when you ask, and the panel should feel free to be concise in response as well. So the floor is open. And we've got, Sydney has the microphone there, so yeah, I think, okay.
Anna mentioned otherness in the opening, and otherness can apply to each one of you panelists as well as African Americans. And perhaps you can comment on when I hear a white supremacist comment in my little conversational group, I have a choice of either taking that person to task or letting it ride, but I don't think that's the responsible thing to do. Perhaps you've encountered those, and could you recommend a course of action?
Oh, gee golly. Yeah. I don't have an easy answer, but from my experience, we are challenged to be able to provide facts at this point that, unless the other side is receptive to being willing to listen. And what a political operative said to me a few years ago, and it stuck in my mind, is that, you know, when you break down society, American society, on practically any issue, you got 20% that won't listen no matter what you have to say. You have 20% that are going to listen and just want some facts because they'll be positive about what you're going to say. And then you got that whole 40-60% in between. And it takes a quick assessment, number one, of can you do anything? Where does that person fit on that continuum? Because if they're part of that 20% at the bottom, there may be nothing you can do at that point to change their mind. But if you're in a crowd where there are people who are within that 60% who are listening, then you may be able to affect them. And the issue in the end is that there are two things. One is, and I heard this over and over again tonight and reiterated, that you have to make people real to other people. It's when they get to know people individually that they begin to see beyond the face value. And the second thing is that there's this whole discussion, I mentioned it in there, about shared values and behaviors. You'll never win an argument based on differences. If you think about the cultural iceberg, what shows above the waterline is everything that's different, and so it's about religion and dress and race and culture and food and everything else. Those are the different things you see the first time. Difference helps you to understand uniqueness of individuals, but to get to inclusion, you have to drill down and you have to look at shared values and behaviors. What goes beyond those issues that may in fact be a commonality? Well, just about everybody loves family. They value family. It's a love of family. Can you have a conversation? Can you build something based on that? Well, everybody appreciates the right to vote. You may not like how they vote, but there's an appreciation of the right to vote. People want their children to be successful. They want an education for their children. So it's about beginning to identify issues at that point that can really touch those other people. But quite frankly, I don't even try to argue with a supremacist because it's hopeless.
If I may just briefly mention from the Catholic perspective, I just want to remind us, in January, the bishops of the United States put out an actual pastoral letter on racism, which in some ways connects to the question of supremacy when we think one is superior to the other. But in responding to your question, I think for me, the deeper question is how do we help one another to really reconnect with that human dignity? And I think your question in terms of the context, I think those are very particular circumstances. And in my limited experience, there are moments when I can maybe provide a different perspective, not with the intention to change someone, but to at least say, in my experience, this particular group of people or this particular person is different. So I would just mention that, but I did want to just put a plug in for the pastoral letter on racism that came out from the bishops. Also, not just for the Catholics, but for all of us to see how are communities dealing with these issues.
More questions? Yeah, right there.
The spigot is not going to probably be turned off forever. So what can we learn from the successful Bosnian immigration issue in St. Louis in the 90s, so that when the spigot gets turned back on, we can get more than our fair share of new immigrants? And how can these three religious groups sort of magnify what the International Institute is doing so that we can all work? Because resources are always limited.
Well, the spigot is turned off from overseas, but one of the things I keep saying to local leaders is there are still plenty of refugees around the United States right now that haven't had a decent resettlement experience. And we don't necessarily have to resettle individuals from overseas right now. What we need to do is identify individuals in other cities, in fact, that would see what we have to offer as an opportunity. So I think the strategy changes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that until such time as the spigot opens up again from overseas, that we can't be helping refugees and other immigrants. We just have to find the right attraction mechanism to find the people that we benefit from. We have to offer. So that's the first thing. The issue of how do we attract more from overseas is a little bit more complicated because the process itself is, we don't have control of the process. The federal government has control of the process. But we very much have control of the ability to be able to help people who have freedom of internal movement in the United States to actually choose St. Louis. And that's where I quite frankly think we should be looking.
Okay, when it comes to Bosnians, one thing I think is important when we speak about why Bosnians were successful in St. Louis. I think one of the main reasons for their success was a huge number of them came to St. Louis. And one of the things they liked about St. Louis is huge Bosnian concentration, especially in South City, which started to feel like little Bosnia, like small Bosnia. And sometimes first generation of refugees, first generation of immigrants, it's hard for them, for example, to connect to those who are immediately to adopt American way of life. Let's call it that way. Next generation will eventually will adopt that way of life. It's sooner or later it's something what must be. But those first steps and at the beginning, first generation, what I feel they need is their own kind, those who experience the same thing they experienced. And believe me, these people experience the worst atrocities that can experience, that human being can experience. And sometimes it's not only up to them, sometimes it's up to us, or up to those who are admitting them, or who are hosting them into St. Louis, that they cannot feel the way they feel. They cannot feel what they are feeling. So it's for me and from my experience, from experience of Bosnians, I believe that for some story of refugees or for some group of refugees, it would be really beneficial if you concentrate them in some big groups, so that you at the end and eventually can see their impacts. Now we in St. Louis can see the impacts of Bosnians because huge number of them came to south city of St. Louis, and they rehabbed the area, renovated houses, and etc., etc. But we cannot see the impacts of Syrian refugees or Congolese or other refugees because of the small number of them who come to St. Louis. And it's probably much harder for them to adapt to new society, to adapt to American way of life when they are just thrown into totally different society, into totally different way of life. For Bosnians, and Bosnian experience is why I think that will work for even others. Sometimes I know that even Bosnians, some of them will say, "Oh, we are hardworking, we are this, we are this, we are this." I don't believe that. I believe that if you give the same chance, if you give the same circumstances to others, that they will be successful. They will do the same what Bosnians did in south city of St. Louis.
Eldin, I just want to interject one thing there, though. We have to remember in the case of the Bosnians, it was a unique situation. It was the last large group of refugees resettled in the United States prior to 9/11. And after 9/11, the refugee resettlement program entirely changed by federal rules, and they started to resettle small pockets of individuals all over the United States, as opposed to large-scale groups, particularly of quote-unquote Muslims. So there was a very different change in a post-9/11 environment. The other thing I just want to add about Bosnians, though, is that their education level was very high commensurate to the U.S. And when they got over here, they were able to really benefit from the last of the manufacturing work that was available still in St. Louis. And it gave them a step up in terms of getting settled here in a way that they might not have been as beneficial in certain other cities. The group, therefore, that is the most obvious that we should be looking at right now for the next wave of resettlement from other cities in the U.S., I keep going back to that, are something called a special immigrant visa holder. And those are Iraqis and Afghans who actually were employed by the NGOs and U.S. Armed Forces in those two countries and have been pulled out of the countries in advance of our withdrawal. These are civil engineers and doctors who patched up our people at the hospitals, and pharmacists and interpreters and drivers, etc. And they're a high-skilled population, and things like refugee career path services, etc., become very important and attractive mechanisms for these people who may in fact be driving cabs in Dearborn, Michigan. So there are strategies there to be able to attract that group that would be beneficial also. But the idea of just being able to get big groups from overseas, it's a different world out there for resettlement right now in post 9/11.
As I was listening to your presentations, I recognized sort of two strands of effort. One is kind of organized, systematic efforts to provide resources and services, and one is a kind of consciousness raising or motivating, mobilizing the faithful to connect individually. It's obviously the distribution of resources and services is crucial. My experience, treasured experience, coming to know refugee families, that just as important is the feeling of having family here, and that's something I think that an agency can't do, only an individual can do. So I'm curious, as someone who's always trying to light a fire among my own Latter-day Saint faith community on this issue, we have our own collective memory of our refugee experience as well. Where is my bandwidth best spent? Are there more religious agencies needed out there? Should we organize our own, our own committees and efforts? Or is it better to motivate individuals to go and get involved in the agencies and programs that are already running and be involved in that way?
Well, I mean, in terms of I want to say in terms of the Catholic thinking, we always think in terms of both and. I know that might sound a little bit, but it's important to say, I think in terms of the involvement, let me just concretize it in terms of our, for example, our Hispanic communities. You know, I mentioned we have 12 parishes. So I think for us, just looking at that population, how do we work with those Hispanic communities to make sure that they feel that they have the resources they need as a community to thrive? So I think the support as a community is important, and then to also motivate with them that together they can have a greater impact. So how do we help those communities, just to mention the Hispanics, for example, the 12 parishes, how do we work with them? How do we accompany them as communities? How do we look into the richness of their own expertise and resources and put them into service? At the individual level, I mentioned earlier in my comments, I think that this particular conversation on the immigrant, I do believe it's important to do the individual part, because I look at the average Catholic in the pew. How comfortable are they with reaching out to the migrant and the refugee? I mean, I cannot assume they are. I cannot even assume that perhaps they're comfortable with the Catholic teaching on the issue. So for me, the individual person, you know, that human person, that concrete individual is just as important as a community. So how can I reach to that person and say to that person, you know, here is what the church, what your faith asks of you. You may not be comfortable in a big group, in a community, doing perhaps a march or a rally or something that is much more of a political nature. But can you offer your gifts and talents and be present in this event? So again, for me as a Catholic, I think our thinking of the both and strategy has served us well, and I would like to continue that.
I want to echo the both and I think though it's also really important to be cognizant of not only the bandwidth of your faith community, and I'm gonna speak maybe I'm gonna overstep my bounds to the International Institute, but you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that for every project that we do as a Jewish community for the International Institute, and we hope overwhelmingly is beneficial, it takes resources from the International Institute. So when we organize Jewish volunteers to run a summer camp, someone from the Institute needs to be able to connect to the families, explain to them what the summer camp is, tell them about that process, make sure that we know all of the different considerations of these individual families. And so we are also somewhat of a strain. Now the camp actually grew out right after, I think it was the first travel ban was announced, and the Jewish community, I think overwhelmingly started calling the Institute saying, how can we help, how can we help, how can we help? And I don't remember which way the phone call went, but somehow we got connected, and the Institute said, we can't field 100 phone calls from individuals, and we said, okay, we'll take our people. You tell us what we can do, and we'll organize our people. But you know, so on the one hand, there's a beauty of that face-to-face interaction, and on the other hand, that becomes its own strain. And so I would definitely encourage people to want to get involved as individuals, but to think about, I mean, when the Institute has its potlucks, right, that's a great entry point to meet people one-on-one that doesn't add an extra burden. Or as Javier was saying, finding people in the churches. So what are existing programs where people can be mobilized as individuals that aren't then becoming more of a drain on what are already incredibly limited resources?
Yeah, let me just quickly interject also that I think it's great for groups to step forward to volunteer. But sometimes if they do unique projects together, or they take on one particular family or something like that, it's a challenge, because you may take on one family and there may be 5 other families then that don't have the same kind of services, which is very difficult then to be able to explain to the families out there who all feel that they have equal needs. But also I think there's a richness to the experience that's there when individuals from one group collaborate with individuals from another group, because you're not just then interacting with the refugees and immigrants and helping them, but you're learning about each other and your organizations and motivations and faith, etc. And so it becomes a richer process that way than it necessarily is when you simply do things in a segregated manner. I think that the people from the Jewish community, for instance, who volunteer with our home visitor program and stuff, where they work with people of different faiths, and where the woman, in fact, who coordinates it is Episcopal, etc. That's an interesting way for them to, in fact, have a richer experience than if they did everything with people specifically from their faith.
Neil?
Thank you for coming to speak tonight. I suppose the last answer sort of touches on my question, but for the 3 panelists operating from the different religious traditions, my question is, what makes a faith-based approach better than a secular or non-denominational approach to questions of refugees and immigrants? Additionally, do you feel that a faith-based approach is necessary for both of these questions?
So, I will start. Depends on the intentions. Sometimes the faith approach can be harmful, I would say. Depends on what you want from refugees. If you want to convert them, if you want to change their beliefs, if you want to change, I mean, especially their beliefs, and are attacking their beliefs, then that's the wrong way you are going. So both are, I think, useful. It doesn't matter from which point you start, from which point you do. Whatever you do, you help them. Just help them. So whether it be religiously motivated by anything, just help those who are in need.
Again, I would say that I don't know that it makes it better, but I just want to maybe share a little personal note in terms of the Catholic perspective to the 3 points I'm going to make to your question. One is, for example, in the U.S. Catholic Church, many of us may not know that about 40% of the U.S. Catholic Church is Latino. So that to me says something about who we are as a church in light of this particular question and narrative of the immigrant identity. So for me, the question about, in terms of the faith nuance or the faith expression of this commitment, one is, I think that just from that perspective alone, there ought to be a connection. The immigrant story, the immigrant narrative, it's our narrative as a faith community. The Catholics, Irish, Polish, German, Eastern Europeans, they're all immigrants. So we are not talking about them and us. So I think from a Catholic perspective, again, doesn't make it better, but it makes it honest and true and direct. So this connection, I think, is important. The second piece is, I think, taking ownership of our identity as an immigrant church, and to not forget that for ourselves as Catholics, that is who we have always been, both sociologically, because of the immigrant experience, but theologically. We know in our Catholic theology, we are a pilgrim church. We are our journey. We are ourselves migrants. So this identity runs deep in our own spirituality and understanding. And then thirdly, I would just say, it's a matter of responding to our gospel faith and mandate. It is not an option. To be a Catholic is to be for embracing the immigrant and the migrant. This is not a question of a choice. It's a question of living out what Christ has already asked of us. So I would say that would be the way in which a Catholic would begin to frame.
I don't think that the faith-based approach from the Jewish community makes the work that we do better. I think it makes us prouder to be Jewish. And that, I think, is really crucial for us, that what does it mean for our Jewish community to know that that's our identity and this is who we are?
think we have time for maybe one more question.
Let me really quickly say.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, let me really quickly just say, in response to that, one of the things I want to clarify also about the International Institute, while we were founded by the Young Women's Christian Association, we are actually non-denominational and work with all organizations, whether they are faith-based or not. Because as it's been so eloquently said here, we're really about providing the services. One of the few things that refugees can bring with them when they come from overseas is their faith. And so we don't believe they have to give that up to be resettled in this country. So we want to be able to work with organizations, faith and non-faith, that really recognize and value the fact that people may want to retain their own faith, but appreciate the handout that they're being given at that point.
Thank you.
One of the, a moment ago, Anna was mentioning about what we share, what we have in common. I couldn't help but notice when Marie gave the introduction to each of you, if I heard correctly, I think every single one of you is a parent. And that's certainly something that you all have in common that you will share. Can you describe to us what the experience of the children is like, and what the way that the children interact with each other improves and enhances the immigrant experience, and how those children can also interact better with the non-immigrant children of our communities to help our region be better?
I have 3 children. My oldest is 7.5, I have a 5.5-year-old, and I have a 4-year-old. And there's sometimes just kind of a beautiful simplicity that they're able, just to, I don't mean that overly simplistic, but just to see through so much of the nonsense. And I remember my oldest was 5 the first year we went to the International Institute for our Jewish and Muslim Day of Service. And we just had groups of kids, and we brought along games, and it was really just playing with each other. And it was Jenga, it was Connect 4, lots of games that you don't really require language to be able to play. And he just had a phenomenal time. And I think it was that, I don't remember if it would have been February, so that would have been Christmas time, and then the travel ban was announced just a few months after. Was it January? Was it that recent? And so the marches started at the airports, and we decided we were going to take the kids to the airport to participate in the protests. And so we went home, we kind of went out for lunch, and then we went home and we started making signs, and they said, "What are we doing?" And I said, "Well, remember when you were playing with that young girl and you were playing Jenga?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, she's from Syria, and some people think that she shouldn't be allowed to come here." And he's like, "Well, that's dumb." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "They think she's scary." And he's like, "Psh," and he's like, "Let's go." And so, but there's just an ability to connect that isn't all about, my kids understand that they have a faith, they understand that there's people of different faith, but and my kids know that there are people who can be scary. There's people that make them uncomfortable, right? But they can tell the difference between people that they feel a discomfort with and somebody that they're told to be different from. And so it's part of what's been beautiful about the summer camp also. There's just a way to cut through all of that overlay that we put on everybody to just really the core of, this is just a person, as Anna was saying, right? They love to play, they love their parents, they love life, they love sports, they love, whatever it is, and it really just gets at the heart. And it just reminds us, I think, of all the ways that we have crafted these narratives around us. And I love the ability, and I think kids can do it to adults also, to really just slide right through it. So whenever we have the chance to bring our children along, or to expose our community to other children, I just see the results just flourish so immediately.
I just want to take 2 seconds to say that my wife is in the audience and we do not have any children. Confession time.
I have 3 children. I think that children will overcome all issues refugees and those who are hosts have. So children will create their own cultures. So they are basically adapting really fast.
Yeah, and I think that there are a couple of things that are inevitably happening, and we need to grasp them and children really are our future in lots of different ways, but particularly around issues of race and culture. 48% I think it is, of Gen Z now are non-white, and it's like 43% of millennials. There is a tectonic shift that's taking place right now, I believe, in this country because of the growing diversity within the younger generation. And if we can figure out how to be able to help these young people interact and learn, in fact, not just about themselves and their own cultures, but about other cultures, and do this when they're young enough before they learn to hate, then we can begin to make inroads in this god-awful environment we have right now, where too many of us hate people or are afraid of people because we just don't know any better. So it starts with the kids. We have to figure out how to be able to harness change and to leave this world in a slightly better place than it was when we came into it.
Well, amen. I'm